Good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Good morning or good evening. Really appreciate you tuning in to spend a little bit of time on us at this third of our Quick Tips webinar series. Ransomware, recognizing, reacting, and responding. For those of you that might not have joined us for one of these sessions previously, Quick Tip webinars are a new webinar format that we have launched this year at ACFCS, and essentially they're shorter, more practically oriented presentations, really designed for people that might be new to the topics or maybe an intermediate level, not so much designed as a deep dive as a quick, useful, directly applicable overview of the material that we're covering. So today we are taking a look at the cyber scourge of ransomware, and we are going to be covering what it is, some of the forms that it takes, the vulnerabilities that it exploits, and leaving off with a look at how you actually respond to ransomware incidents, either on a personal level or organizational level. You know, I know that this has hit a number of organizations, but also a number of individuals, including some of you that might be out there on the line today. So again, thank you for joining us. We are going to do our best to keep this within the half-hour time span, but that said, we do want to address your questions. We want to make this as useful to you as possible, so please do ask questions throughout the presentation. You'll see a Q&A icon at the top of your Cisco WebEx Event Center tool or on the bottom right-hand corner. Either location, type your questions into the chat box within that Q&A tab. We will be able to field your questions. If it makes sense, we might stop and field it at the time. If not, we will definitely take it at the end of the presentation. So please do ask questions. This session is being recorded. It will be posted to the site within 3 business days of this presentation, along with the slide deck. So be on the lookout for an email. When that's posted, you'll receive an email with a link to view the recording and view the deck should you want to go back and do so. Finally, you'll be given a short survey at the end of this presentation. Do take a minute to fill that out. Give us your thoughts on this presentation. Again, give us your thoughts on this kind of quick tips webinar format as well, the shorter half-hour version. We'll continue to do the 1-hour webinars. It's just another way to get you information and training. And let us know what other topics you'd like to see us cover, particularly in the half-hour format. Just in case you're not familiar with ACFCS, we are a leading provider of tools and resources to professionals who work to detect and prevent financial crime in both the public and private sectors. We have members all around the world. We provide member benefits like news analysis training like this webinar here, and the CFCS credential, really the only credential that covers all aspects of financial crime. So really urge you to visit our website, acfcs.org, and learn more about the organization if you're not familiar with us. I'm joined on this, and I apologize, I'm remiss in introducing my colleague, Brian Monroe, who's joining me on this session. I am Brian Kindle, VP of Program Development with ACFCS. I am joined by Brian Monroe, the Director of Content, and he'll be helping me out and chiming in from time to time on some of the ransomware issues. So, Brian, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's jump in with some statistics and just a general overview of what ransomware is and what it looks like. And as the name implies, ransomware is a form of malware, malicious software, enters a computer network and locks down a network or locks down files on that network in some way. We'll look at a couple different examples or a couple different forms that ransomware can take. But regardless of what species of ransomware you encounter, the incidence of ransomware attacks have risen very substantially in 2016 in particular. Just in the last year, we've seen a really very, very substantial increase. And so some cybersecurity experts have referred to 2016 as the year of ransomware. This is really the year ransomware came into its own as a form of cyber attack, you know, apart from a takeover or business email compromise, or some of the other ones. Ransomware has really taken off in the past year. 1/4 of attacks are targeting the United States all around the world. The FBI put out 2 notices on this in March and April, provided some good tips. There's links there in the slides which you'll be able to access. There's another document that's a prevention guide from the FBI that's a little later on in these slides. Provide some good basic tips to safeguard against ransomware. Now, a lot of what can be done to mitigate the harm of ransomware and protect against it spreading on a network really applies to the IT side. I know, and which, is not necessarily the people on this line, but things like access control and read-write permissions and disabling macros within emails on your organization's email network, all that stuff is something that really your IT department is probably going to have to take on, or your cyber, incident response team is going to have to take on. We're also going to look at things that you can do, on a more personal level. And in addition, like any kind of cybercrime and cyber fraud that we talk about, so much of it relies on the human factor. So much of the way this malware, which we'll talk about in just a second, so much of the way this malware, this ransomware penetrates system gets on machines is from human-facing weaknesses. The same stuff that we see in, business email compromise or account takeover or these banking Trojans that get on people's computers. Same vulnerabilities, same weaknesses, although taking on some interesting new mutations and variants in the ransomware context. So we'll talk about that in particular, the human weakness. One point I want to mention here is that the variants of this are increasing, which makes it even more important to do things like update antivirus and have antivirus and other software auto-updated on your network and your systems, because there are new varieties and new permutations of some of the ransomware, malware kits and pieces of ransomware floating around out there being developed all the time. This is being done as a service. You can go on the dark web, you can buy a malware kit. It has ransomware built into it. It has a botnet, a network of basically computers that have been infected with malicious software and are used to distribute information or distribute emails. So it includes botnet services, so you can spam emails or transmit information. It includes the malware itself. It includes the support to receive payment, usually through Bitcoin, as we'll talk about in a second. And so it's very easy to do this. And as a result, we're seeing more and more players move into this space. Mobile ransomware is another thing that is important to be aware of. The prevalence of mobile ransomware has increased dramatically in the last year. You see the increase in the number of attacks from 2014 to 2015. I've seen statistics that essentially double the 2015 number now at this point. So mobile devices are also at risk for this similar type of attack, and that it includes, that raises the secondary or follow-on risk of the bring your own device to work issue. If people are bringing devices to work, connecting to your organization's network, that's a ransomware risk too, and that's something you have to keep in mind and control for. So what are your organization's bring your own device policies? And do they create a risk of ransomware jumping onto your network from a mobile device, which wasn't something that we necessarily had to worry about in the past, but is moving in that direction. Ransomware, you see some statistics there. When the FBI put up this notice back in March and April, they estimated $209 million was paid to criminals involved in ransomware. The FBI also estimated that it probably had gone up. It probably would be $1 billion or more by the end of the year. Most people I know that do look at this say that it's probably over $1 billion. And underreporting really is pretty common with this. A lot of times people just pay it. A lot of times the amount is small. The average ransomware payment is about $650. Now, when we talk about the average, we're talking about a lot of individuals who are having their computer infected and then, simply paying the money because they're scared or they don't want to deal with the hassle, or they have a particularly nasty ransomware, which we'll talk about in just a second. Organizationally, we see much larger payouts. We saw a hospital pay 17 grand. We've seen payments similar to that and similar to, even larger amounts. And those are just the ones that are published. I was talking to an individual that worked with a European company in ransomware case, and in that case, it was a high six-figure payment that they were looking at, not some of these smaller payments. It was not something that was publicized or put out there, but it was a pretty substantial amount of money that they were trying to decide whether or not to pay. So when we talk about, the published figures, it's very likely they are underestimating. Let's talk about some variants of ransomware. And, from your perspective, it does matter to understand these, but the goal is not to be infected with any of these, right? You don't really want any ransomware, whether it's nasty or nice, in relative terms, to be on your system. But there are nicer, quote unquote, nicer versions and quote unquote nastier versions. So moving up the scale, starting with what's sometimes called scareware, or basically a lesser form of ransomware. There are types of ransomware that lock your computer without necessarily encrypting your files. So ransomware is typically associated with file encryption. The software will get onto your machine, get onto your network, and encrypt some files that essentially it can find in whatever network or whatever system it's infected. Depending on the ransomware, that might be more files, less files. The virulence of it in terms of its ability to spread might vary. But there are other types of ransomware that simply lock the computer. And a lot of times these can be dealt with without paying the ransom that they're asking for. They're more just to scare you and to scare the unsuspecting or uninformed person than they are something you can't do anything about, like some forms of ransomware, or at least that it's very difficult to do something about. So this is one example of a screenshot of what this looks like. It's claiming that the user is in violation of some law, and it actually cites a law there, and it has the Department of Justice logo. And then it's asking, interestingly, for the user to go to a location. It conveniently gives some locations there where these green dot money pack cards are sold, and to buy a money pack card and provide them the code on the back so that they can use the prepaid card, essentially a prepaid card code that they're trying to obtain. It even has an email there, fine@fbi.gov, that you can email to ask questions, or to email the code from your green dot cards. And, it has the place where you enter the code right there. So this is a pretty convenient system, and this is obviously how the federal government usually operates. They lock down your computer and then fine you $200, very normal. So obviously this is, not a real government process, a real law enforcement process, but this has worked in the past. I think, all these schemes have a lifespan, and these types of scareware, as more people become aware of them, are on the decline. But it's interesting that they did use the prepaid card system for this one rather than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is more prevalently used in the ransomware context. It's really kind of the coin of the realm for ransomware. This one is a screenshot of CryptoWall. This was popular a couple of years ago, still used. One's called Locky and KleptoZepto are two varieties that are popular. There's another one that's called Necromunda, something like that, Necromund, that's also quite popular. These are some of the ones you can just go buy online and utilize out there. But this is an example of the more traditional kind of ransomware that will lock up the files, encrypt them, basically put them, encode them in a way that it is theoretically at least unbreakable. We'll look at ways to actually break it in just a second. But this is kind of traditionally the way that ransomware will operate, and the way that it works, and the payment mechanism that will ask you to pay it in this case, Bitcoin or another form of digital currency. There is a more virulent one and variations on this. This one this one's called Jigsaw. I think it came out about a year or so ago in reference to that really, really bad series of horror films. And rather than simply encrypting your files, it encrypts them, demands a certain amount of Bitcoin or other payment. If it's not paid at that time, the ransom goes up and files start to get deleted. Now, previous examples of ransomware had made this threat and then not followed through with the threat to delete the files. Scareware does the same thing. It'll say all your files are deleted. This one actually went through with it. This form of ransomware and the cyber criminals behind it actually go through with it and start deleting files. Sometimes only a few, and as it says there, during the first 24 hours, you only use a few files, the second day a few hundred, the third day a few thousand, until it wipes out as many files as it can. And so this is obviously a much nastier form of ransomware and a greater threat. There's a third kind of evolution more recently that I saw that was posted on forums online, which is a similar kind of thing that deletes your files, encrypts your files, deletes your files. It also threatens to collect all your login information to websites, emails, so on and so forth, and then distribute it out to all of your contacts and basically, expose all your password information. I don't know if it follows up. I couldn't find information on whether this actually followed up with this thread, but it's interesting evolution in the ransomware space. And you see with this one, it's asking at the bottom, please send at least 5,000 worth of Bitcoin. So it's a much higher ask, presumably because it thinks this threat to capture all of your password information will be more effective. So in any case, those are some of the variants out there. Why is it important to know that? Because it helps you to understand how you respond to them. If you're dealing with scareware, it's much different than if you're dealing with something much more nasty that's going to potentially delete your files if you don't pay. Even if you're dealing with something that's just going to encrypt your files, that's different than something that's going to try to delete your files if you don't pay, because, as we'll talk about in just a second, a lot of security companies have found ways to actually break the encryption and decrypt files from this ransomware, and new ones are being unbroken each day. So if you really don't want to pay and there isn't a solution to decrypt your files right now, you could potentially image the hard drive, put it on save the hard drive image somewhere, and wait for a while and see if the encryption on this form of ransomware is broken. It is one option. We'll talk more at the end about other options. Who's behind this? I was talking to a cybercrime expert that does the work on ransomware cases. They said it's primarily the usual suspects: Russia, Eastern Europe, a little bit of Brazil. There has been some people who have noticed or believe that Chinese actors have entered more prevalently than in the past. And 40% or a greater proportion of victims do end up paying. And when you pay, usually your files are decrypted. Now, not always. We'll talk about one case, one kind of high-profile case in which they weren't actually decrypted in just a second. But usually, this is a business model, and these actors want to make money. They don't want to have the word get out that that victims are simply having their files decrypted or deleted or whatever, because then people will stop paying them. So it's an incentive to seek out new victims, and there's an incentive for the victims to honor their end, the cyber criminals to essentially honor their end of the deal. The end result is that we're seeing more players in the space. We're seeing more high-level attacks against large institutions, financial institutions and otherwise, but we're also seeing more low-level attacks, partly driven by this malware as a service kind of phenomenon, partly driven by the fact that the chip and pin system has made credit card fraud a little bit more difficult, and it's driven some people to look for other sources of income into the ransomware realm. So you have more amateurs, and you have also a prevalence of sophisticated actors. And Brian, I think you had a comment that you wanted to make on the higher end attacks.
Yes, this is something, Brian, that when I was researching this, you're talking about now these, blanket attacks that are going out. But just as you said, as more players enter the market, more low-end players, there's also more high-end players. So rather than just a blanket untargeted email, criminal gangs are getting more creative and sophisticated, engaging in more thoughtful, targeted attacks against larger organizations. These attacks typically involve advanced techniques, some used by nation states involved in cyber espionage, and involve just not just locking up the company's systems for money, but also breaking into the system to find account and credit card numbers, details to create fake identities, or nab public or private intellectual property. Some attacks that seem now like a standard ransomware attack were only later found to involve these hybrid viral contagions that self-propagated through the system to send details about a network back to the criminal orchestrators while they bring the system itself to a halt. So really the ransomware is just a cover to break into the system. Last point, what's worse, if that company out of desperation pays the fee, that knowledge spreads to the bulk of the criminal underbelly like wildfire, increasing the likelihood that other attackers will follow suit while trying to get their share of the profits and attack that same company again.
Yeah, it's a great point, and as Brian's saying, you know, a lot of not a lot of times, but there are instances where ransomware is just a smokescreen. It's a smokescreen to cover up a higher level intrusion on the system. And so when we're talking about remediation, which we'll talk about at the end, it's really important to keep that in mind. You can decrypt your files, you can you know, stop the bleeding, prevent the attack from spreading, and think you're done. But you need, you know, on the response side, to remember that there could be more going on here, and to continue the forensics and continue the, you know, the thorough review of your cybersecurity with that knowledge, you know, kind of foremost. So as Brian was saying, you know, the more sophisticated actors and even the less sophisticated actors utilize email. 59% of ransomware comes through email. So all of the basic email security stuff, the care that you need to exercise with email is extremely important. And in the business email compromise quick tips we did a couple weeks back, we talked about some of those techniques, things like checking the email header if you are curious about who it's from, scanning every attachment with an antivirus tool before you open the attachment, so on and so forth. Really, you know, it's not sophisticated stuff, but it actually is effective in a lot of cases. Interestingly, 24% is websites, web applications, and 4% social media. One recent thing that I've found kind of disturbing is that ransomware, a particular breed called Locky, is spreading through images. Opening an image, the code is embedded in the image, and for this ransomware, and when you open it, it jumps onto your machine. So you have to be very careful if somebody is, you know, using the chat tool on Facebook, for example, and sending you an image or sending you an image via another social media site. Be careful about that, particularly if it's somebody you don't know very well, or maybe it is a, you know, old friend who hasn't been very active, or you didn't even know was on Facebook but is all of a sudden sending you something. You again need to be very careful of what you click on when it comes not just onto social media, but on websites in general. Malvertising has been a big problem. Malware embedded in ads. The New York Times, even a lot of other very high-level sites with tons of traffic that you would not necessarily expect to have malware embedded within their advertising, have struggled with this. You see a tweet from the New York Times right there. Don't click on a pop-up box warning about a virus. It's an unauthorized ad we're working to eliminate. So we've seen new and creative avenues, you know, again, as companies get better about screening bad emails and people become more and more aware of the dangers of emails, the creative avenues to deliver malicious software and access machines continue to expand. This isn't just a financial institution problem. This is very much a broad sector kind of problem. We've seen police departments get hit with this. We have seen hospitals get hit with this. We've seen hotels get hit with this. Kansas Heart Hospital was a story a little while back. You see the San Francisco light rail system got hit with it. Attackers look for companies in particular that have operations that can't really stand to be interrupted, right? So there was a hotel in Switzerland, I believe, where they placed ransomware on the system that controlled the electronic system that controlled the door keys. All of a sudden, there were like 130 some people who were locked out of their door because the door key system key files had been encrypted and it was no longer functioning. That's not really something you can mess around with. It is an urgent, kind of sensitive operational issue, and so you have to pay the ransomware. You could, theoretically work on it for a little bit, and we'll talk about, again, some ways to do that, but you basically have to pay the ransomware when you have that disruption to your core operations. Likewise, police stations, if they have files encrypted that have to do with cases, investigations, so on and so forth, they can't really afford to, mess around with that. Hospitals, healthcare obviously has very time-sensitive data that sometimes gets encrypted in these types of attacks. So Kansas Heart Hospital got hit with a ransomware attack and then paid it. What happened was the attackers got the money and said, okay, great, thanks for the money. Give us some more money. So they didn't honor their deal in this case. They didn't decrypt the files. They went back and hit them up for more. And this time the hospital said no, and their files were actually deleted. Now, these were files that were not, applicable to any kind of ongoing operations or something. They were essentially records, but it was still highly disruptive and damaging for the hospital. So there is that consideration, that calculus that goes into paying. When we talk about responding to ransomware, step one is a good offense. And this is true when we're in the ransomware context or in any number of other contexts. Be safe online. It's basic stuff, but it does help. There's a bunch of tools like this out there, but there's a tool called Web of Trust. You can either use it online or you can actually install it on your browser. And it helps to, it's a tool that basically gives you a real-time view. So if you search something on Google or any of the other search engines, you get that whole list of websites. Web of Trust will show a little icon next to them that indicates whether the website has a good reputation, an excellent reputation, okay reputation, or very poor reputation for things like malicious software or compromises in the site or so on and so forth. So it's a way for you to get a quick snapshot of how safe the site is that you're searching. And should you visit a site that's unsafe, it'll pop up and it'll say, hey, this website has a bad reputation or it's had these issues. Do you want to continue before you going there? So again, there's other tools out there. This isn't just intended to promote any one product or solution. Virustotal is another one that allows you to look at sites in terms of known incidences of viruses and malware found on the site. Ad blockers can be useful if you're doing a lot of internet searching, if you're doing a lot of internet browsing, maybe you're doing open source intelligence work or investigations. An ad blocker can help block out some of the malicious ads you might face. System patches, updates to operating systems. We talked about access control logs and macro scripts, and then training. Ongoing training and testing is really important and maybe one of the best lines of defense that you have. How do you, other ways to respond? Step one is to stop the bleeding, stop the spread of the ransomware should it get onto your computer or your network. Disconnect or power down if appropriate. Now, you're not always going to want to do that. For example, in the case where you have some of the more nastier forms of ransomware that do delete your files, should you try to power down, that's a consideration you want to take. But if it's a more traditional kind of ransomware, disconnecting from the internet is certainly going to be a step you want to take, and powering down your machine to stop the spread. And then whenever possible, use a clean, uninfected machine to research your options to unlock the computer, unlock your files, because you can, in some cases, unlock your files. You need to understand what was actually encrypted. What machines were impacted, what systems were impacted, how sensitive is the data. Most cases, this is going to involve IT or cyber incident response. The big question that makes ransomware very disruptive to an organization, or in some cases not disruptive at all, there are instances where companies are not really affected by a ransomware attack very much at all, and the key differentiator is backups. How robust are your backups, and what's the process for backing up? The ideal is to have 3 levels of backup: a backup for your machine, a backup for your network, and then a third level of that's a physical backup that's kept in a separate location that is not connected to the machine and the network they're backing up. It's air-gapped, or there's a gap between the backup, whatever it is, the hard drive or the tape or whatever. There's a gap between the backup and the internet so that something can't get onto it. If you have robust backup systems, a lot of times you can just say, okay, well, big deal, it's locked. I'll just go to the backup and I'll relaunch. I'll reload the files. If you haven't been backing up frequently, or you haven't, your backups are also infected, which in some cases happens. The backups end up getting locked down because they're connected to the network or on the same network. Then you are in, then you must move on to another step, which is figure out if you can unlock it. Not all ransomware is foolproof. A lot of cybersecurity and cyber companies out there have developed decryption tools, but the first step is you need to figure out what variant you're facing. There's several tools out there that can do this online. ID Ransomware is one of those. You see the link right there, and then you find your decryptor. Hopefully it exists. Avast, Kaspersky, AVG, ESET, EMSoft, these are all companies that have issued decryptors for one variant on ransomware, or in some cases several variants on ransomware. If these don't have a solution, there might be others out there. Like I said, they're constantly being developed. Forums, there's a lot of tech forums that are really helpful. Bleeping Computer is one that I think is quite good. They have a forum on ransomware where techies and expert people basically provide free advice on this kind of stuff and can help with guidance. So it's possible to unlock it. If you can't do that, then you have to figure out if you pay or you don't pay. And that's not something that we can or will really provide advice on the webinar. That's a decision that has to be made, for yourself or your own organization. A lot of people recommend that you don't pay. It's something that can, it's certainly something that rewards the attackers and their business model, and it's something that could potentially put you at risk to get hit up again, like in the Kansas Heart Health System, although I will say that in most cases that doesn't happen. The best way to avoid making that decision at all is, again, secure your own machines, secure your own networks with robust backups, and have a response plan and be prepared. There's a really good site called No More Ransom that has a whole set of tools. It has guides on making a prevention plan to ransomware. It also has guides on identifying decryptors in addition and including some of the ones we looked at here. The FBI's ransomware prevention and response is a little less thorough. No More Ransom is a cooperative effort among cybersecurity and law enforcement. FBI is just a document, but it's still useful as kind of a starting point. I definitely recommend checking out the No More Ransom. I think it's just www.nomoreransom.org, but again, the link is in here because I think it's a useful, kind of one-stop shop in addition to all the other resources we talked about here. Last thing to highlight is report the ransom. Contact the FBI and Secret Service, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, and the sooner the better. Try to capture in this reporting all the details that law enforcement might find helpful, both what happened, the general kind of overview of the incident, if it was an email attack, the content of the email, the sender of the email, the type of malware used, if you've known that, if you've used something like ID Ransomware, IP addresses, URLs of malicious software or sites that you visited. If you're part of the FSISAC, Financial Services Information Sharing, oh gosh, I forget the AC, but it's a financial services information sharing group. It's a kind of a quasi-public information sharing group. Share information through FSISAC. They have online portals, or you can contact the regional point of contact for your FSISAC to get the information out there. This helps other institutions within the FSISAC to understand the threat that you're facing. The last point before we answer some questions are the way the money moves through this. If you're from the financial institution, if you're coming at this from the financial institution perspective, which I know a lot of people on here are, there are considerations for money laundering and transaction monitoring associated with ransomware. Payments typically made through Bitcoin, but a customer has to get the money into Bitcoin. So if you're seeing a customer suddenly make a large transaction or a series of large transactions to a virtual currency exchange, and they've never before done this, maybe they're just interested in buying some Bitcoin, maybe it is a ransomware transaction. It's something we have to keep in mind for SAR and STR filing. The other thing is, if you have customers who have money that they're pulling out of Bitcoin exchanges on a regular basis, that they're transferring out of the exchange into cash, and transferring to an account that they hold with your institution, you have to keep that in mind as somebody who may be profiting from a ransomware scheme. Now, for the most part, these criminals are not located in the U.S., but there certainly are some that are located in the U.S. So it's another type of activity to keep in mind. And there's opportunities here for information sharing. I was speaking with a few months back, I was speaking with the chief compliance officer of one of the largest Bitcoin exchanges, and they were talking about working with a bank on a ransomware case in order to share information and make sure they had everything they needed for SAR filing and so on and so forth. The last thing is there's some good guidance on this, not specifically ransomware, but cyber information sharing in general in the FinCEN's recent guidance. I think this was back in October that they put out on cyber-enabled crime that provides a little bit more insight for the SAR reporting, as well as some tips on kind of sharing information within the context of compliance and cyber and fraud. Brian, did you have any comments or any thoughts you wanted to add on those points?
Absolutely, Brian. Just a few very quick things. Kind of seminal events that happened last year in financial crime compliance is convergence. The OCC, issued comments on how cyber threats and AML threats resemble one another. Also, the OCC issued a voluntary cybersecurity assessment tool last year, 2 years ago, which includes elements of the NIST cybersecurity framework. OCC also began incorporating cyber assessment tool and asking about cyber assessments in exams, I believe in 2015. And now, as well, Brian said about this FinCEN guidance. FinCEN has been huge in kind of, as well, asking that information be shared, this kind of information, not just with your AML teams, but your fraud teams, your cyber teams, asking for more kind of coordination between the teams. The guidance that he talked about had four main pieces. I'll just go through them quickly here. But the first was reporting cyber-enabled crime and cyber events through SARS. Number two, including relevant and available cyber-related information, such as Internet Protocol addresses, timestamps, virtual wallet information, device identifiers, in those SARs. Collaboration, this is a huge part and also validation of our mission, collaborating between BSA, AML units, and in-house cybersecurity units to identify suspicious activity. And lastly, sharing information, including cyber-related information among financial institutions to guard against and report money laundering, terrorism financing, and cyber-enabled crime. So, huge thing, kind of a sea change, if you will, in the industry, but one that we're helping everyone be prepared for.
Whoop, thanks, Brian. So I was mute there, talking to myself. As Brian said, there's definitely this kind of merger between, AML and cyber that's been progressing for a while now, but this was the biggest kind of confirmation or the biggest sign that the regulators would be looking closely at it. And this isn't formal, regulatory standard, but it is guidance that at least implies it's moving in that direction. Last point that we'll end up on, this is just some tips for you to kind of go forward from here. You can use the tools we talked about to better safeguard your online experience. Spreading the word is extremely important. Like any ransomware, you're only as protected as the weakest link at your organization. So the guy with the worst cybersecurity practices, the worst, browsing practices, email practices, so on and so forth, is the guy you really need to be worried about. So you got to get spread the word out there to colleagues and to whatever extent you can, even your customers in some cases, as well as your vendors, subcontractors, anybody that operates on your network. Finally, start creating a response plan. You may be in compliance, you may be in AML, you may be in fraud, so on and so forth, but you still might play a role in responding to a cybercrime incident, both ransomware and cybercrime more broadly. So it's important to think about it as not just a kind of abstract problem, but your organization, your department's, your unit's problem as well, because it will, you know, not in every case, but there is likely to be at some point a cyber incident that does you or should involve you. So keep those things in mind. So questions, I swear one day we're going to get these quick tips to be actually a half hour, but I appreciate everybody staying over a little bit here. So I have some questions on the mobile device front. Which mobile devices are getting attacked? iPhone, Droid, Samsung. They're all getting attacked. The ones that I've seen attacked most often are those running the Android operating system. I think there's a number of there's a great deal of types of ransomware that attack the Android operating system. I think there's more than are going after Apple operating systems. But that's partly a product, you know, it's a little bit of a, you know, it's a little bit hard to say because there's just way more Android phones and there's way more people utilizing the Android system, so it's not surprising. Does that make Apple products less vulnerable? Another person's asking. You know, for now, I think that they are slightly less vulnerable. Over the summer, there were a few new variants of ransomware that did target iPhones and iPads in particular, and I think we'll see more of that coming out. So Android might have been first, but I don't think Apple is, you know, is particularly safe, I would say. And somebody's wondering, can the Locky ransomware infect your smartphones? I don't know about Locky in particular, actually. I'm not sure what exactly the varieties are that impact iPhones or smartphones in particular. But you know, Locky is one of the bigger ransomwares certainly for PC. I don't know if it applies to phones, but in any case, I'm not sure if Locky does, but there are certainly types of ransomware that do infect smartphones. All right, any remaining questions? I don't see any further ones coming in. Thanks again for attending, everyone. Really appreciate the time and attention. Again, thank you for being a part of ACFCS and a part of this Quick Tips webinar. Again, it has been recorded. It will be posted to the site, and you will be able to view the recording and the slides within a couple of days of this presentation. Appreciate the time and attention, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.